I'm honored to be chairing this panel. We've got four very distinguished speakers, experts that bring different perspectives to the discussion, a discussion that has so far today been very rich, dynamic, analytically rigorous, so very much to my liking so far. We're going to start off first with Yaniv Voller, who is an assistant professor at the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Kent. Each of our speakers have a rather extensive biography, but you can find that in the booklet. So I'll keep the introductions short and go straight to Yaniv, please.
Excellent, thank you so much. And again, it's a great pleasure to be in this beautiful city. So I'm really grateful for the invitation by Brookings and the Middle East Institute. First of all, it's quite interesting. There's a saying in Israel that we don't live in Scandinavia. Whenever someone criticizes the government for overspending money on our security or on the question of the Israeli program, people always say we're not in Scandinavia. We're not surrounded by Sweden and Norway. I think many in Israel would have been delighted about Israel being placed along Iceland and Sweden and Norway. But that's just a side note. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about Israel as a small state. And my presentation is divided roughly into three parts. In the first part, I'm actually going to try and establish the fact that Israel is a small state and should be understood as a small state. And it's not as obvious as it sounds. In the second part, I'm actually going to talk about how this has actually affected Israeli foreign policy, especially in the region. So how Israel has established its geopolitical policies toward its neighbors in the Middle East. And in the third part, I'm going to show how soft power has been particularly important for Israeli foreign policy in the region as a small state. Okay, so as I said, Israel is something of a unique case when we discuss small states, because many studies of small states have actually been divided over the question of whether Israel should be treated as a small state or not. Now, if we try to look at the criteria used to define small states, I think we can probably say that Israel is a relatively small state, right? The Israeli population, the size of the Israeli population is about 9 million residents. Again, excluding, of course, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The size of Israeli territory is about 20 kilometers or 8,000 square miles. Again, excluding the West Bank. So geographically, demographically, or both, Israel is dwarfed by most of its neighbors. However, quite a few students of small states, quite a few theoreticians of small states have explicitly rejected the idea of treating Israel as a small state, right? So they've pointed out that Israel has a powerful military, it has political influence, disproportionate political influence in Washington, and that Israel is nuclear power capabilities. So, and for these reasons, students of small states have refused to treat Israel as such. However, I argue that Israel must be understood as a small state. And the reason for that is that the Israelis themselves perceive Israel to be a small state, right? So I think this is an indication for my constructivist leaning, right? I don't have a statistical analysis of this self-perception, but it is true. Most Israelis, including the Israeli leadership, view Israel as a small tiny state, right? Half a pin on the world map. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, for example, declared not too long ago that Israel is a small state which has neither geographic nor demographic depth. And he actually made this statement to justify his objection to bringing in Syrian refugees to Israel. But again, it's an indication of how Israelis perceive of their country. Beyond the fact that Israel has a small territory, this idea of this Israeli self-perception has also been influenced a lot by Israel's isolation from its neighbors. So, again, just to make it short, Israel should be understood as a small state because this is how Israel is, because this is how the Israeli leadership perceives the country. This is how they perceive the state. And this point is crucial because this perception has shaped Israel's foreign policy making and strategies, especially in the region. The most obvious aspect, of course, is Israel's reluctance to allow the formation of a Palestinian state in the West Bank, right? Because many Israelis have indicated the fact that they've used the term Israel's narrow waistline when we talk about in reference to how the West Bank is close to the center of Israel. But I actually want to focus more on Israel's regional foreign policy and how this self-perception as a small state has affected its choice of alliances with neighboring countries. And perhaps the embodiment of Israel's self-perception as a small state and how and its impact on Israel's foreign policy is what has come to be known as Israel's Periphery doctrine. From its first years of existence, Israel believed that it could compensate for the lack of strategic depth and for the lack of demographic depth by creating a periphery and by creating a regional periphery. And this is why Israeli leaders have tried to establish alliances with other actors that they believed also exist in the region's periphery and that have shared security interests. Now, so throughout the first decades of Israel's existence, the Israeli leadership tried to establish contacts with non-Arab or non-Muslim actors, including Iran, Turkey, Ethiopia, the Maronites in Lebanon, and occasionally the Kurds in Iraq, or even again for a very short period with southern rebels in Sudan. Again, these are a few examples. Now, Israel's view of what is periphery began to change in the 1990s and the 2000s, right? Obviously, Iran is ceased to be seen as a potential ally for obvious reasons. And more recently, Turkey as well lost its position as a useful regional ally. But Israel has now identified a new so-called periphery. And this new periphery has included what is often described in Israel as the moderate Arab states. And within this camp of the moderate Arab states, Israel has been particularly keen to develop relations with the Gulf monarchies, right? With Saudi Arabia, with the Emirates, with Bahrain, Oman, and sometimes even Qatar. Now, undeniably, there is a realpolitik element here. Israel shares with these states hostility toward seeming Iranian expansionist aspirations in the region. But I argue that Israel's eagerness to establish contacts with these countries actually goes beyond simple realpolitik considerations. Israel also views these states as a reflection of itself, right? So small, prosperous states dwarfed by their neighbors. And this is where Israel identifies the potential for relations, again, that go beyond ad hoc alliance against Iran. I think, in fact, Israel actually identifies a potential for more substantial relations, believing that these states have an interest in long-term relations with Israel's most important foreign policy aim, persuading other actors that that Israel is actually a legitimate actor that deserves to exist and prosper in the region. Now, the evidence for this perception lies in how Israeli public and official discourse relate to the Gulf states, right? So I haven't prepared examples because I was concerned that I might not have time, but Israeli media in Hebrew and English constantly features reports about how the small Gulf monarchies, which are constantly under Iranian threat, and how they seek Israel's support. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that this is the situation, but this is definitely how Israelis perceive the situation to be. Now, I actually started working, I actually published a paper on Israel's Periphery doctrine in 2016. But here I would like to add another element which I didn't discuss in my previous paper and I hope to develop. And I want to discuss the actions that Israel has taken to further strengthen its ties with its potential new allies. And I argue that here Israel has combined both hard and soft power. And in fact, I actually argue that soft power has probably played an even more significant role than hard power in attracting allies. Now, I think Israel's use of hard power is relatively easy to identify, right? Israel has constantly attacked Iranian bases in Syria and Hezbollah. Israel has constantly attacked Iranian bases in Syria and Hezbollah armed convoys from Syria to Lebanon. And the immediate short-term aim of these attacks has been to undermine the capacity of Iran and Hezbollah to attack Israel from Lebanon and from Syria. But according to some commentators, you cannot ignore the fact that, at least in some cases, these attacks have been not less about signaling Israel's capacity to reach even the remoter part of the Middle East than simply destroying Iranian or Hezbollah capacity. And I think that this undoubtedly sits with Israel's size and lack of strategic depth. And again, language is actually important here. It's about the idea of Israel's attacks on Iranian and so I'm going to rush. Israel's attacks on Iran and Syria have been about demonstrating Israel's long arm and capacity to protect the interests of Israel and its not just Israel, but also its allies in the Gulf and the Middle East. However, as I said, Israel has also relied on soft power in order to woo its allies in the periphery, perhaps even more so than hard power. Now, soft power is not necessarily associated only with small states, right? I mean, soft power is mostly associated with the US and American foreign policy. But the way I see it, many small states have actually found soft power to be a very useful strategy. So Qatar is a really good example for that, and Qatar has developed its power in the recent years, as previously discussed. But as I argue, soft power has also been a significant part of Israel's appeal to its allies in the periphery. And much of the soft power has been about demonstrating to these allies Israel's technological achievements. For example, if in the previous years it was about demonstrating to others Israel's agricultural new medical technologies, more recently it's been about cyber warfare. And Israel has been really keen on selling cyber technologies to its new allies. And as I argue, this is not just a revenue generating source. It's also been about demonstrating to its neighbors that Israel is a legitimate, influential actor that can and should exist. And this is why Israel, for example, has been willing to sell the Saudis and the Emiratis technologies that only a few years ago they wouldn't have sold to regional countries. So I wanted to elaborate a bit more about it, but I'm running out of time. So again, just to conclude, Israel is a small country because it perceives itself to be a small country. This has had an important role in shaping Israeli foreign policy. And soft power has been an important element in establishing alliances. Thank you.
Very much, Yaniv. Some food for thought there, and no doubt we'll be coming back to some of the issues you raised in your presentation. We now come to Jacob Eriksson from the University of York, whose presentation is Swedish and Norwegian foreign policies of peace.
Thank you also to Ranj and Brookings. Sense present what arguably I think are what we might describe as more methods of small state foreign policy and small state power. We've been looking at a few different from the Middle East. I think the more conventional examples that we tend to see in the literature are cases like particularly Norway, but also I would argue to a some. What I'll do is to go over the roots of Swedish and Norwegian foreign policies of peace, and to a series of involvement in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in particular, and to try and draw some broader conclusions, I guess, of small state foreign policy that we see being practiced by countries like Sweden and Norway. So if you start with Sweden, case heard a number of terms used this morning, not least by Heinz, who was through a number of different terminology. If we look at Swedish foreign policy of the 20th century, is that we see a reliance to what I guess we would describe as kind of classical neutrality during the Second World War, to a shift towards what we in Sweden at least called active neutrality. And I think active neutrality being understood slightly differently from the way that it was described this morning. An active neutrality that had to do with ensuring Sweden's non-involvement and non-entanglement in potential Cold War conflicts. And the idea with active neutrality was that you try and maintain neutrality by taking what could arguably be described as kind of principled stances in foreign policy. So active neutrality was about speaking out on issues like human rights, for example, on democracy. The neutrality didn't mean not expressing very strongly held views and principles on a number of issues. And so what we see in terms of domestic roots of this type of policy is that it's very much anchored in the social democratic party in Sweden that was very, very prominent throughout the 20th century and really is the kind of political bedrock of the Swedish political system. And the idea of solidarity, the idea that there is a shared interest and a kind of shared human interest that means that we should be interested and involved in the affairs of others. And the idea in foreign policy is that this solidarity extends to people beyond borders, that this is more of a kind of universal principle that is important. And if we look at the kind of foundational principles of foreign policy, it has to do with the importance of international law to protect small states, particularly in the context of the Cold War, when we had small states that were very vulnerable to, for example, superpower rivalries. The idea was that we needed to respect and rhetorically also try and strengthen the foundations of international law in order to ensure that there is a system of rules that protects the smaller states. So Sweden was a very vocal proponent of the UN, principles of the non-use of force, for example, and underscoring the need for the peaceful resolution of disputes. And as far as possible, tried to practice these principles in its foreign policy. What we see during the Cold War is that Sweden was a very outspoken critic of both the US and the USSR along these lines, particularly in, for example, the Vietnam War, where Sweden was one of the leading European voices denouncing and condemning American involvement in Vietnam, and similarly denouncing the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And these positions as part of active neutrality led to some people describing Sweden as the world's leading exporter of unsolicited advice. Not necessarily a particularly flattering moniker, one that I would certainly argue is true. Sweden was not shy about speaking its mind on international issues. Now, how does this fit with what we might describe as traditional small state policies of bandwagoning? Sweden really saw its foreign policy as being part of ensuring a neutrality and ensuring what I could call credibility, and trying to really kind of practice what they were preaching. But at the same time, Sweden was under the protection during the Cold War of the American nuclear umbrella. So in a sense, I think you could argue that Sweden was kind of enjoying the best of both worlds, simultaneously being able to very freely criticize, but again, knowing that if anything were to happen, that the West and the Americans in particular knew that Sweden's real connection and sympathies was with the West. So Richard Nixon, for example, was no great fan of our Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme, who was going out and criticizing the Vietnam War, referring to him, and excuse my French here, but that Swedish arsehole. Those are not my words, those are Richard Nixon's words. So it caused a great deal of upset, but at the same time, we have like Henry Kissinger acknowledging that Sweden's policy of neutrality in the Nordic area was central to stability in Northern Europe during the Cold War as a kind of neutral state that was helping to maintain a peaceful status quo and avoid any type of superpower conflict in Northern Europe. So it's an interesting set of relations that Sweden manages to maintain during this period. And so what we see is that we have a development of a foreign policy that emphasizes diplomacy to looking more at conflict prevention in the 1990s, continuing to be involved in, for example, multilateral peace efforts, and that there are moral and more rational economic arguments that are made for these particular positions. And I'll say a bit more about the rational arguments later. Norway is, in some cases, a similar story, but deviates in a few different ways. If we think about the kind of history of Norwegian foreign policy as a state, it's very much rooted in the desire to avoid great power conflict. It's constructed in the early 20th century very much as a counterweight to the kind of European regional realpolitik that is creating an awful lot of conflict. So the Norwegians see themselves as wanting to distance from this particular process, and some scholars like Leira argue that peace is really an identity issue for Norwegians, that this idea of being a peaceful state is kind of maybe not dissimilar to what Bawood was talking about with Oman, that being peaceful is a part of identity. In Norway throughout the 20th century, what we see is a kind of periodic fluctuation between issues of neutrality, idealism, and realism. So in the immediate kind of post-independence period, there was a big emphasis in Norway on neutrality, on things like free trade, international law, the idea of cooperation as being central. But all of this is, of course, severely tested by the Second World War, when, of course, Nazi Germany invades Norway, occupies it, and the Norwegian state takes a much more realistic, meant in the sense of political international relations realism after the Second World War, and decides to be part of NATO. Norway is a founding member of NATO, and switches much more to a realist position, and sees NATO membership in particular as how it is looking to guarantee security. At the same time, it also continues to have those kind of principled bases of kind of international law and peacefulness, and these coexist not necessarily always easily, but they do coexist within Norwegian foreign policy. And this idea kind of emerges in the 1990s that there really needs to be a shift towards these kind of original values that underlied Norwegian foreign policy to the value-based policy which is possible in the kind of post-Cold War world. And so what we've seen from the 1990s is that there's very much been this kind of Norwegian self-identification, certainly by some people, as Norway saves the world, thus Norway exists. It's been a very kind of active foreign policy of mediation and peace that has really kind of led to an identification as a kind of peaceful country, but there's also led to a great deal of work as a mediator in a number of international conflicts. So if we consider Norwegian efforts in places like Colombia, Guatemala, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Norway has kind of become synonymous with the idea of mediation. And if we go back to where that kind of really started, it was in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with the Oslo Agreement of 1993. So in terms of trying to think about some empirical cases then to show how we can link these foreign policies of peace with the practice of mediation, we have a number of different cases from the late 1980s onwards where Sweden and Norway were involved either to kind of a more prominent extent, or as is I think more often the case, in a more kind of secretive way to try and practice what we might refer to as kind of secret diplomacy. And so we have Sweden, for example, taking advantage of its very outspoken international policy during the Cold War, particularly on the issue of the Palestinians and the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories, taking advantage of that particular position with the Palestinians to become a mediator and to open up relations between the US and the PLO, which can be seen as an important kind of precursor to the Oslo process, where you start trying to have conversations across the two sides about the idea of peace, playing a very prominent role in the Oslo process. And what's interesting is that we have a key role being played not just by the state, but also by NGOs, which I'll say a little bit more about in my kind of concluding remarks. But so we have a very prominent engagement in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which, if we think about the extent of Norwegian involvement, and Norway is in the lead of the ad hoc liaison committee, the kind of aid mechanism, Norway invests heavily in the Israeli-Palestinian process, and we're talking about hundreds upon hundreds of millions of dollars as an investment in the peace process, but also as an investment in its foreign policy. And we have a later empirical example as well as Sweden getting involved in some track 2 mediation and some secret diplomacy that takes place in 1995, known as the Beilan Abu Mazen understandings, that I've done a lot of work on, where we see again a relationship between state and NGO as mediators to try and create a framework for a permanent status agreement between the Israelis and Palestinians. So what we see is that we have a number of smaller agreements that are reached, and we have Swedish and Norwegian mediation being very significant and influential in terms of thinking about the final peace agreement. But I don't think we can say that small states have been particularly successful in actually resolving the conflict. And of course, we can reflect on why indeed that is. But as Mehran was saying this morning, maybe it has to do with the inability of small states to follow up and to actually be able to hold the parties to the conflict accountable for what they actually agreed to. So just to conclude, in terms of a few common features that we can identify between the Swedish and the Norwegian cases, I think traditionally we can argue that they're very well suited for something like mediation as a key foreign policy tool. They're closely associated with the peaceful resolution of disputes. In a kind of realist mode of thinking, they are non-threatening as small states. But I think what is interesting to stress about the cases is that first, the idea of values being very, very closely connected to interests, and that values are seen as something which is central to their foreign policy, something that gives them influence, this idea of influence through value diplomacy, the importance of international law, but also that these peace policies are seen as something that strengthens national security in a way that traditional military means just wouldn't do. The other thing that I mentioned this morning is this idea of an overarching cross-party foreign policy consensus that we see in these cases. Both Sweden and Norway, regardless of which party is in power, shares this kind of bedrock of foreign policy consensus that is largely questioned. And one of the things that we see, for example, is the commitment to foreign aid that Norway has been doing so heavily in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Whether or not we see this as a particularly good return on that investment is, again, an open question that we can discuss. But I think it is a very important feature. And I'm currently, I've just finished a bit of work on, but I continue to do a little bit of work on in terms of how we characterize small states, is an interesting feature that I think is connected to the liberal democratic nature of Norway and Sweden, which is that we have a strong relationship between the state and NGOs, who play a very, very important role in the kind of mediation process. And so that it's not just necessarily about being a small state, but it's also perhaps important to consider the type of political system that the state practices and how this might make it more suitable for a particular type of approach. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jacob. And hopefully we can extend that conversation. I personally am interested to know a bit more about the metrics, perhaps, that might be out there when it comes to peace building or peacemaking efforts, but also the unintended consequences, which is critical, especially in fast evolving conflict environments with all sorts of parties. Which ones do you include, you don't, and so forth. We'll now move on to Juergen Braunstein, who'll be presenting on Singapore in the global energy transition. Over to you.
Okay. So I would like to start with a personal story. The last time when I was here in Singapore was about 3 years ago, in 2016. At that time, I participated at a roundtable on the future of energy in Singapore. This was followed by a dinner organized by an ExxonMobil executive in a very nice restaurant. Unfortunately, cannot remember it. I had my first chili crab and really enjoyed it. And it was not without reason, this dinner. The same year, Exxon bought Jurong Aromatics Corporation, what you see here in the picture. That's one of the largest petrochemical plants in the world. And one of the major talking points in this evening dinner was about Exxon's strategy in getting a foot into Asia by investing in downstream activities in Singapore. And apart from this, another very interesting topic at this evening, and it draws on a speech given by the Minister of Home Affairs, Shanmugam. this speech was a few days earlier, and he outlined the next challenges for Singapore over the next 50 years. And in his remarks, the oil and petrochemical sector played a central role in this future of Singapore. And a major issue at that time was around Indonesia and Malaysia, and the concern that these countries moving rapidly up the value chain and then becoming increasingly competitive vis-à-vis Singapore, and this creates tremendous problems for the future of this country. So that was back in 2016. So since then, just a few things happened, like the election of President Trump, a fully fledged trade war between China and US, then the aggressive LNG, liquefied natural gas application in China, which kind of led to the phenomenal rise of LNG worldwide. Then also increasingly what we see, the emancipation of other Asian states in the LNG sector. And most notably and most prominently, recently the Gulf countries' emancipation and there's aggressive start in entering the downstream sector. I will come to this later. So if we would have this evening lunch today, so that the points would have been completely different, and it would be about Singapore's position in an environment in which it increasingly has to compete with major G countries in the downstream sector. It would include the role of LNG and Singapore's position in this emerging area, and about what's the Singapore's strategic location in the whole kind of global energy transition, which we kind of define by a slow move in the energy mix, which includes like low carbon applications, the whole issue of as I mentioned, LNG, solar panels, and so on. So does Singapore play a role in this? But before I address some of these questions, let's have a brief look at how Singapore has done so far and how we got here. So this graphic shows or gives us an overview of Singapore's export in 2016. We clearly can see the prominent role of petrochemicals, and also in terms of the crude oil. So I'm not colorblind, but I'm not sure whether how it's this lavender kind of color and the brown one. So we see it's almost 1/4 of the exports of Singapore in 2016 was in this petrochemical arena. So which contributes significantly to Singapore's trade surplus. However, this is just a static view, and over the last 40 years we have seen some changes. So if I go to the next slide, we see on the left side, again in brown, we see in the earlier years that oil refining was comparatively larger part of the GDP, until the financial crisis in 2007-8, we see a drop. And if you look at the table here, that's very fascinating for me. It gives us an overview of the 1970s, kind of the petroleum products were responsible for 1/3 of Singapore's total exports. So that's pretty remarkable for a country that has no oil or gas resources, that has no hinterland, that has, so I come to this back later. And Singapore at that time was even nicknamed the Houston of Asia by a scholar, by Singapore scholar Tilak Doshi, and it was called the swing refiner of the Asian Pacific. So in 1980s, for instance, Singapore was the largest refining center after the US Gulf Coast and Rotterdam. So this itself was a product of statecraft. And it was a product of statecraft in a sense of the first generation of leaders in Singapore, in the ability of convincing the larger oil majors to establish their refining facilities in Singapore, like Shell, Esso, BP, Mobil. And we had today also one of the legends of this first generation here in the room sitting on the very behind. So G.Y. Pillay. It was a great honor to see him today. However, as also one of the first speakers, I think he's not anymore here, but as one of the first speakers today, the chairman of the center highlighted the issue of circumstances, or the issue of agency, institutions, and circumstances. And if we look, Singapore could not be what it is without a set of circumstances. And here I would refer to the geopolitical circumstances in terms of its strategic locations and in a region that experienced tremendous amounts of growth over the last decades, and also the lack of global instability and war. For instance, Singapore developed its oil refining capacity specifically during the Vietnam War, where the US troops needed a lot of oil. And also in the 1970s, oil shock provided Singapore with an opportunity, and the Singaporeans took the opportunity when the major oil companies' grip on the oil supply system was critically weakened. Singapore stepped in and was uniquely placed to take advantage of this. So overall, we can say that Singapore was a major beneficiary, or is a major beneficiary, of the high carbon economy. So I don't want to read this out, but the question remains, if Singapore was such a beneficiary of this high carbon economy, what would it mean if we now in this carbon transition towards less oil, would this affect to name a previous speaker, Mr. Hashim, who said this agile dolphin, is Singapore still agile and to adjust to this changing environment? And here I just want to provide you with some food of thought in terms of the energy transition. What are we seeing? I would like to concentrate more on the third aspect in terms of the recent announcements of pretty all of the major GCC countries in terms of their determination of going downstream. So we have, for instance, Abu Dhabi, the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company announced in 2018, so not so long ago, an investment of about 45 billion to create the largest single integrated refining and petrochemical projects in the world. Similar things have been stated by Saudi Arabia, and also they want to move critical parts of their petroleum production into the petrochemical sector. Also, Kuwait plans to do the same. So what does this mean? And if we again look here, the GCC countries, which I've mentioned, they are the major suppliers of oil to Singapore. So in the first picture we see this. So what does this mean when your suppliers actually start doing now the production, what you actually do, and kind of carving you out? Singapore is not any longer needed in the whole process. I want to be a bit provocative, but so this raises a kind of a set of questions, and how does Singapore react to these developments, and what should we do? Here is just, I should have added a question mark of this. So Singapore has a large exposure to a sector which is under pressure, at least over the long term. And what does it mean? And what should Singapore actually, what are the potential ways of coping with this increasing pressure? Here I've just outlined a couple of options, but some of these options, like becoming an LNG hub for Asia, would make sense. But the question is Singapore, in terms of it doesn't have, first of all, the domestic market for LNG, for kind of using it for domestic trading and arbitrage. And we have other countries like, especially Korea, India, and Japan, and they create their own LNG terminals, and in terms of also in other energy areas, and to be independent. Another question relates to collaboration, and in terms of collaborating with, or finding ways of collaborating with the Middle Eastern countries in terms of these in terms of downstream sectors, and also the question of is the Middle East willing to collaborate on this? And the whole issue of renewables, what's Singapore's role in renewables, and that it's still, and on the other hand, if you talk to the International Energy Agency, they recently released a report that's saying about the continuation of oil over the next 20 or 30 years, which I believe still will the shift to renewables and the energy transition will not take place from overnight. But yeah, this question remains what Singapore is doing and what it should do in terms of adjusting to these structural changes, as successful as it was in the past in terms of grasping these opportunities. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Juergen, for that fascinating, data-rich presentation. We're now going to move on to Baldur Thorhallsson. That's how I normally end my introductions. Who'll be joining us in Iceland, I believe, via Webex. And I'm not too sure if he will be coming up on the big screen. Is he for now, or? No? Okay, yeah, there he is. Fantastic. And he'll be presenting on small states and shelter Iceland's external affairs.
Hello, Chair and distinguished from Europe. Good morning or good afternoon from Europe. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to talk about my favorite subject, small states, and my newly published book, Small States and Shelter Theory, Iceland's External Affairs. I'm sorry that I cannot be with you in Singapore, but I hope I will be able to come and visit you soon. So this book seeks to develop shelter theory and use it to make a comprehensive analysis of Iceland's external affairs from the time it took full control of its foreign affairs from Denmark in 1940 to the present. I will split my presentation into 4 parts. First, I will introduce the theory. Second, I will present our finding regarding Iceland's relations with its main ally during the Cold War, the United States. The third part will provide an overview of Iceland's search for a shelter provider after the United States deserted Iceland in 2006 and 2008. Finally, there is a short summary and a reflection on the importance of multilateralism versus bilateralism for small states. I hope you understand I'm only gonna be able to provide you with a brief version of our findings, and I have to leave out several aspects such as Iceland's participation in the European project and the important Nordic cooperation. But then first on theory. Small states are a very diverse group, as all of you know and you've already heard. While members of this diverse group of states presently face very different challenges, I would say that all of them have to compensate for size-related problems. The more successful small European states, such as the Nordic states, the Benelux, Austria and Switzerland, have developed certain domestic features such as democratic corporatism, the welfare state, and a comprehensive public administration in order to cope with their smallness. Accordingly, I think it's fair to say that small state can buffer from within, but there are limits to what a small state can do on its own. A small state also needs an external protector, a state, to provide it shelter. So our book is about the external dimension of inherent size-related difficulties in states. The importance of our key concept, shelter, is related to three interrelated features. First, the reduction of risk in the face of a possible crisis event. Second, help in absorbing shocks during a crisis situation. And third and finally, assistance in dealing with the aftermath of the crisis. We argue that small states need external shelter in order to survive and prosper. They are dependent on economic, political, and societal shelter provided by large states as well as regional and international organizations. And we distinguish between these three forms of shelter, if I just briefly go over them. First comes political shelter, and it takes the shape of direct and visible diplomatic or military backing by another state or an international organization, and it includes as well organizational rules and norms. Economic shelter can include direct economic assistance, a currency union, help from an external financial authority, favorable market access, etc. Also provided by a more powerful country or by an international organizations. And the third form of shelter, societal shelter, can contain the diffusion or contains the diffusion of foreign people and ideas in order to avoid social stagnation and to make up for a lack of indigenous knowledge. We argue that cultural transaction with the outside world in terms of transfer of messages, norms, values, and lifestyles are essential for the prosperity of a small community. The traditional international relations and small state literature often neglect the importance of societal relations. It is through constant interaction with other culture and ideas that a society evolves and moves forward. And I think it's highly important we bring this into our analysis. That all said about shelter or protection often comes at a certain cost. And to be clear, we are not suggesting that relations between small and large states are always beneficial for the smaller entity. And it's certainly not true that larger states always act out of some kind of compassion. When a quest for protection and assurance is successful, a price must often be paid in terms of sacrifice of autonomy in the control of national resources and loss of freedom of political maneuver and choice. So we define shelter as composed of those external relations which are favorable to the small entity. However, we also take into account the external relations which are harmful to the small state over the years. So the validity of the theory depends on the proportion of benefits to costs. Let's now move to our case, and let's start with the Icelandic-American relations. American assistance was crucial for the prosperity of Iceland from the US occupation of the country in the Second World War until 2006. The United States provided extensive political and economic shelter, as well as some societal shelter. We identify 5 main shelter components. I'm going to just briefly go over these 5 shelter components. Firstly, the United States and membership of NATO were essential components of Iceland's national security. Secondly, with American assistance, Iceland also found shelter within US-dominated international organizations such as OEEC, World Bank, and IMF. The US provided Iceland with extensive diplomatic backing, and the US negotiated favorable trade agreements and access to loans for Iceland. Thirdly, Iceland's strategic importance to the US gave Iceland the leverage to win each of the 4 court wars. The court wars were disputes between Iceland and Britain over Iceland's extension of fishing zone or territorial waters. Iceland won these disputes in large part due to assistance from the US and NATO. Fourthly, the Americans provided extensive economic shelter to Iceland. The US base will provide Iceland with about 2 to 5% of its GDP during the period under study, and the Americans financed operations at the Keflavik International Airport in Iceland until 2006. Fifthly, in terms of societal shelter, the Americans transferred norms, lifestyles, and ideas to the island. The US became an increasingly attractive location to pursue higher education for Icelanders over the course of the Cold War. Nevertheless, in 2006, the US closed its military base in Iceland, and in 2008, it refused to provide Iceland with economic assistance during a deep economic downturn, basically an economic collapse. Despite providing financial aid to several other similarly situated countries in order to deal with the global financial crisis. Iceland was no longer regarded of strategic importance to the US. Iceland's long-term ally simply deserted it. Nevertheless, it has to be stated that the bilateral defense agreement between the two countries is still in place, and the US is at present increasing its military activity in and around Iceland. And this is related to increased Russian activity in the North Atlantic. If we now move to the third part, regarding Iceland's search for shelter in the last 10 years. We claim in the book that Iceland is desperately looking for a shelter provider or private providers, and has been doing so ever since the closure of the US military base and the US refusal to bail it out. Iceland started by turning to the European Union for assistance. However, the EU turned down Iceland's request for aid, citing the obvious fact that Iceland was not a member of the club. Though Iceland is a member of the internal market through membership of the European Economic Area. Nevertheless, Iceland applied for membership of the European Union 9 months after the economic crash. And the Europhiles in Iceland tried to sell the 2009 EU membership application as a shelter component to Iceland. However, nationalistic rhetoric and quick economic recovery have firmly frozen the application. To compensate for the diminishing American political shelter, Iceland has sought shelter from alternative sources. Iceland has made civil security agreements, mainly concerning its waters, with Denmark, Norway, Canada, and Britain. Furthermore, airspace surveillance arrangements have been made with various NATO member states, including the 4 other Nordic states. Iceland has also sought to strengthen its ties with NATO in an effort to shore up the organization's provision of shelter to the country. Moreover, Nordic state security cooperation is already of importance to Iceland, providing the country with important political shelter, soft security shelter, such as regarding cyber security. Icelandic politicians have also looked to non-traditional sources for support, namely China and Russia. Iceland was the first European country to sign a free trade agreement with China, which entered into force in 2014, and there is considerable cooperation between the countries in several policy fields, especially regarding the Arctic. Moreover, the Icelandic administration considered a Russian bailout with a substantial loan at the height of the 2008 economic crash. While nothing materialized from the Russian loan offer, the fact remains that Icelandic policymakers were willing to entertain the possibility of a Russian rescue package. Nowadays, Icelandic relations with Russia are diminishing, while its relations with China seem likely to grow in the future. And if you look at Britain, Iceland's close neighbor, many Icelandic politicians see opportunities in Brexit. They are hoping that Iceland will be able to follow Britain around the globe and make free trade agreements. They basically see Britain as a potential economic and political shelter provider for the country in the foreseeable future. So if we now move to the fourth and final part.
Sorry to interrupt, Baldur. You've got around 40 seconds.
40 seconds, yes. You get 40 seconds.
But obviously we can
excellent.
continue the discussion and your presentation during the Q&A. So
Yeah.
now you have 30 seconds, because I just took out 10 seconds.
It will only take 40 seconds. So basically, to summarize the book, the US desertion of Iceland indicates the importance of multilateral political and economic shelter for small states. Policymakers in small European states need to closely examine the extent to which Existence multilateral shelter arrangements such as NATO, the EU, Schengen, the European Economic Area, and the Nordic Council may be more reliable providers of shelter in times of need than a single protector such as the United States or Britain. Our findings indicate that formally binding organizational rules and norms of multilateral arrangements may provide more lasting, comprehensive shelter to a small state than bilateral shelter relations. 39 seconds.
That was quite impressive. Thanks very much. And I think it's certainly something for us to discuss. It's often said that international institutions, organizations are eroding in terms of their impact, significance. So I think there's certainly a question that needs to be answered as to how positioned they are and how effective they might be in protecting small states in the climate that we have today internationally, the so-called rules-based international order being on the decline. We'll open up straight to questions, and Beverly was first off the mark. Beverly. And can you also introduce yourselves when asking questions? Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Beverly Milton-Edwards. Yaniv, thank you very much for your presentation. There are just a few things I wanted to ask you about. One of them, you were speaking about your notion of a narrative by Israelis of perception. Now, you said you didn't have an evidence base for that perception, but what do you think might be that evidence base? The second is I'm going to perhaps suggest a line somewhere between the middle of those that you said see Israel as a large state and your idea of Israel as a small state. And I would call that the David and Goliath paradox, which is actually when it suits Israel, which is probably most of the time, it's very much a Goliath. And we see this in particular in relation to its neighbors and including as an occupying power. Of Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and in East Jerusalem. So I'd be really interested to know what your response to that. And finally, I mean, you're absolutely correct. We've seen quite clear evidence of Israel seeking to build alliances with the Gulf states. And you suggested that one way in which it's demonstrating this through a form of soft power. And again, I'm not sure if soft power is the right term, but I know what you're trying to reach for. Is through, selling technology, particularly around cyber warfare, Israel's fantastic agricultural sector, medical sector, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I would suggest that that's problematic for two reasons. One is the obvious, which is Israel's continuing occupation of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, and its denial of self-determination to the Palestinians. And the second is that as a result of Israel's history, as a small state itself, and it was interesting that our last speaker sort of pointed out the obvious that happened in case of Iceland, is that Israel's dependency and having been sheltered by the United States of America, particularly in terms of the economic kinds of developments that you're talking about, might prove problematic and dare we might say less attractive beyond the glitz and glamour of selling technology. And I don't by any means wish to play down the importance that this has been attributed to in attempting to build those alliances. But there's still a problem in and of itself. But thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Beverly. And we come to Rory Miller, and then...
Oh, thank you. Just a quick question for Jacob. Last time I was in Vienna for work, I was speaking to someone at the National Defense Academy who told me something that I presume is correct, that when the Israeli and maybe Heinz has something to add to this, when the Israeli and Palestinians were looking for a safe place to start negotiating, their first choice was Vienna. But because Vienna was populated by international institutions and there was a concern that the negotiator would be identified and recognized and that would reduce the secrecy. So in those terms, have you looked at Austria in the context? I understand the geographic reason you focus on Sweden and Norway, but is Austria a similar state in terms of its view of its role. I mean, I know, and then the other thing you said in terms of Sweden with its history of relations with the PLO, but Kreisky was probably the leading European actor in promoting. And so, where does Austria's earlier contribution in those terms during the Cold War and these other countries begin?
Thanks, Rory. Let's come to Dr. Heinz and then Mehran, Louise. Dr. Heinz first.
Quickly respond. Of course, Kreisky was the first statesman who brought two-state solutions before the United Nations. So there was some debate already academic, but he was the first one to do so. But Austria is losing this confidence by the Palestinians because the current government is very one-sided, oriented towards Israel, because it wants to overcome the image of anti-Semitism, so they cooperate very closely with Israel, and the Palestinians are losing confidence. So that's maybe the reason. Not so much whether there is classified material may be used in the international organization. Israel is overall everywhere in the international organizations. But the question I want to continue. So the two-state solution, you didn't mention it, but if Israel lacks of strategic defense and considers West Bank and Gaza as a sort of periphery forward defense, and Israel's size doesn't change, so that two-state solution is dead. So there is no possibility for the two-state solution anymore. So if this is the main reason for Israel to occupy this territory. And a second comment I have to Jacob, there is of course this difference between Norway and Sweden, and this is still, Sweden might change its mind, so but still alliance membership. So that's, and I just bring one example. Norway was one of the strongest supporter of the human dimension of nuclear weapons, so which led to the treaty of the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and Norway hosted even a conference, the one in Mexico, one in Vienna, one in Norway, and then NATO put pressure on Norway, and Norway changed its mind and voted against the treaty. So finally, so that's the same might be true for Iceland as well, but alliance membership does play a role in if you're a small state.
We have Mehran.
Thank you. This question is for Jacob. One of the activities that small states do is sometimes nor entrepreneurship, and they carve out a niche for themselves in some arena. And for Norway, one of these arenas has been protection of the environment. But at the same time, Norway is one of the few countries that hunts whales. So how are they squaring that? How are they working on that? I asked this with Qatar in mind, because when Qatar got the negative publicity about it, started implementing meaningful substantive reforms. Where they fell short was to advertise these reforms. But we see it on the ground that there's been meaningful changes to the conditions of labor, working conditions of labor, access to healthcare, in all sorts of ways. Because that pressure worked, or because Qatar was worried about its image. Is there any pressure on Norway in this regard, and is Norway doing anything about it, or that'd be interesting?
Thanks very much, Mehran. To Louise now.
The question is to Jacob as well. You mentioned that there is a political consensus across different parties on the neutrality, so to say, of those countries in international relations. My question is, and I'm not that much updated into the political situation of the countries, but the rising populism that we see in Europe that it's my understanding is affecting especially Sweden as well. And we have far-right countries now with important positions in parliament. Is that undermining in any ways this identity? Do they have a particular foreign policy stance? And how do you see the sustainability of these positions going forward should these movements gain more momentum?
Thanks very much. That's, is the values diminishing? And was there values to start off, as Mehran alluded to, in relation to the environment? Let's start off with Yaniv. You've got a couple of questions, I think.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Beverly, for the questions. I think they give me an opportunity to cover some issues that I didn't get a chance to cover in my presentation. Is it better? Yeah. So in terms of so as I said, I haven't carried out any statistical analysis of the Israeli discourse, but I think it's very, it's very notable. So as someone who spends a lot of time in reading Israeli media and being exposed to Israeli media and public discourse, I would say that this has been a very dominant perception among. I brought one quote from Prime Minister Netanyahu, but this is a very representative quote. Now, it's true that there's sometimes a sense that Israel perceives itself as, I think Prime Minister Eshkol used the term poor old Samson to describe to describe Israeli policies. But most of the times Israel still perceives itself as they, even its more brutal policies in the West Bank, in the occupied territories, that are actually motivated by Israeli fear by Israeli fears that are the outcome of its perception as a small state. Even the West Bank is considered to be a potential threat to Israel, again, because of the geographical proximity of the West Bank to the heart of Israel, to Tel Aviv and the center. And this also relates to your question, Heinz, whether this means that the two-state solution is dead. This has been one of the main justifications, one of the main secular justifications for the rejection of the two-state solution. So, for the Likud party wouldn't talk about the West Bank necessarily as in terms of as a sacred part of Israel. They would prefer to use the more security-oriented discourse of the West Bank threatening the existence of Israel, because the Israeli because of the proximity, the argument is that if Hamas takes over the West Bank, they can actually shoot missiles into Tel Aviv. So I don't think that the two-state solution is dead yet, but if it will die soon, it would probably be because of this explanation rather than claiming Hebron or Nablus to be part of Israeli heritage. In terms of the, just in relation to the third question about the idea of soft power, now, the soft power is about persuading other actors to accept your demands without actually using violence or direct violence. And in this respect, Israel has always aspired to persuade regional neighbors about not just about the legitimacy or the right of Israel to exist, but also of the benefit of having Israel in the region. And part of that has been branding. Part of that has been Israel's self-branding as the startup nation. Right? It should be beneficial for other actors to have Israel around because we can provide you things that no other country can. We can sell you the best technology. We can, if you trade with us, if you actually accept our existence, then you'd benefit. You'd benefit from improving your medical services because you could actually purchase what the desalination technology is. more than ever, cybersecurity. Cybersecurity has become Israel's #1 export. Now, again, it's not just because Israel is trying to brand itself as a startup nation. It also has to do with, again, with profit and with and even security concerns. But in some way, this kind of soft power, the idea of branding Israel as the startup nation, is also about persuading the other potential allies, right? The Gulf monarchies, that you shouldn't really care about what we do in the occupied territories. Because your security concerns have nothing to do with the Palestinians. They have much more to do with Iran. And here, in this way, we can actually help you. So I hope this answers at least some of your questions.
Thanks, Yaniv. I should add, I'm a very generous chair, so if there's any finger interventions, pushback, follow-up, do let me know, and I will give way. Over to you, Jacob.
Great. Thanks, Ranj, and thank you for the interesting questions. Rory, Austria as a possible mediator. It's funny when you analyze and study mediation, there is a real desire to draw a nice, straight, linear relationship between policies and outcomes. People kind of, you reverse engineer it and you say, well, this happened because of this, kind of specific policy, for example. What I think we also need to bear in mind is that a lot of, I think it was mentioned earlier this morning in terms of international relations more broadly, we don't really consider luck and fortune in analysis. And I think one of the main messages that I got from the original negotiators, the academics in Oslo, was that it was essentially a fortuitous coming together of a number of different things, one of them being, really importantly, personalities. That the real driving force behind the Oslo process was the head of a Norwegian NGO called Tajir Thorhallsson. And it was his kind of dynamic personality, his connections and his network that brought everything together. And Sweden also makes an argument to say that the Oslo process happened because when the Swedish Social Democrats were voted out of power in 1991, our then Foreign Minister Sten Andersson said to the Palestinians, if you need anything, go to the Norwegians instead. They'll be more than happy to help you. So Sweden tries to take a lot of credit for setting up that element of the Oslo connection, but I think there's no necessary reason why somewhere like Austria wouldn't have been a fantastic choice for mediation. I think that somewhere like Oslo, and particularly the fact that the Oslo Channel was held outside of Oslo, was attractive because of the secrecy. You do have you have far less international traffic in a place like Oslo than you do in, say, a Geneva or an Austria. But like I say, I think some things happen, kind of for policy reasons, but there's also a significant element of luck in it. So I don't see any reason why, there aren't any number of possible mediators who don't necessarily practice principled foreign policy. The issue of alliances influencing positions, I mean, very, very good example, in addition to the Icelandic example, that Baldur was talking about in terms of alliances influencing thinking. I think this is precisely what Sweden wanted to avoid, to being put in this particular type of position, to have an international alliance that would to take a position on a particular issue that would lead countries to question Sweden's possible neutrality in the event of any type of war. So I think it's actually a very, very good example of precisely why Sweden stuck to the foreign policy that it did, of being effectively kind of non-aligned and independent. Mehran, really interesting question about. I do not know enough about Norwegian policy on whaling to comment specifically, and I don't know if Norway is engaging in a public relations campaign to try and put forward its case for whaling, whether it's the cultural case, whether they might actually be trying to make an environmental argument for whaling in terms of controlling whale populations. I don't know. But what I'd say is that one of the things that we see, and I think this is true of, you know, whether it's Norway, whether it's Sweden, lots of different countries who engage in norm entrepreneurship don't always follow exactly what they preach, but to varying extents you can get away with it. Sweden, for example, for all of its talk of peace and everything else, produces Gripen fighter planes that it tries to sell on international markets. Big Swedish arms manufacturer Bofors, has been selling, kind of heavy artillery and stuff like that to warring countries for many, many decades. These two things seem to kind of coexist, maybe uneasily, but I wouldn't be able to say exactly why certain countries get away with it and certain countries don't. But there's no doubt that there are, in certain areas, contradictions between the different interests that are being pursued. And I think certainly in the Swedish case, there's an argument to be made that there is a political sphere where the peace norm is very much pushed very hard, but at the same time, Sweden also has an economic interest. And you have arms manufacturers in Sweden who, again, are another constituency that need to be accommodated. So I'm afraid it's a bit of an unsatisfactory answer, but I think it's just further evidence of this balancing, I guess, and the uneasy coexistence of these different issues. Finally, Louise, really interesting question about populism, and without wanting to show my own kind of political colors too much, I think it is changing, and I think it's really bad. I think that the rise of the Sweden Democrats is a real problem. And actually, one of the things that we see is that I can't remember now who was mentioning it, but if it was you, Heinz, similar dynamic in Sweden in terms of the Swedish far-right populists really pushing their relations with Israel to counteract accusations of anti-Semitism. And we see this bizarre there's a term that Rogers Brubaker uses, but it's kind of like civilizationism. This argument that there is a kind of Judeo-Christian bond and that they need to together face off against, kind of the dangers of Islam. That's coming, to Sweden as well. I think it does challenge traditional foreign policy values. I think the Sweden Democrats are trying to do that. I'd say outside of that particular party, one of the things that we see, for example, in the Israeli-Palestinian context, the case that I'm probably most familiar with, is that even the left-wing Social Democrats and the right-wing Conservative Party, they take a very similar stance on, say, the Israeli occupation. So there was depending on your perspective, amusing incident when the leader of the kind of Swedish right-wing Conservative Party went to Israel, and they were expecting a different position on the occupation because they were expecting a right-wing conservative government. And the leader went to Israel. The occupation is indefensible. I think this is a terrible idea. And the Israelis were very, very upset because that's not what they thought they were going to be hearing from the leader of the kind of main conservative party. So I think there is consensus on a number of issues, but absolutely the Sweden Democrats are challenging that. And I think it's a real shame, and I think it's a danger. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacob. Baldur, did you want to come in?
Yeah. If I may, there's 3 short comments and questions to my fellow panelists. First, on whaling, Iceland has a similar whaling policy as Norway, and in fact, formally, Iceland is under so-called diplomatic sanction by the United States. This meant that for a long time, almost 10 years, that high-ranking politicians did not visit Iceland, high-ranking US politicians. And we just had the first visit of the US Secretary of State just a couple of weeks ago. The US Secretary of State had not visited Iceland for more than a decade. So suddenly, as the country becomes more strategically important, again, related to the future opening of the Arctic Ocean and the increased Russian activities in the North Arctic, the Americans turn a blind eye to their own diplomatic sanction on Iceland and start to cooperate closely with Iceland. But I think the Norwegians and Iceland's whaling policy has to be understood in the light of the importance for these countries and maybe many small states to utilize natural resources. There is a lack of, generally speaking, there is a lack of natural resources in many small states, and it is of fundamental importance for them to utilize what they have. So basically in Iceland, the view is not going to let anyone tell us what we can do in our waters or how we utilize our resources. And then the two comments or questions. First, Jacob and Sweden. Basically, the question is Sweden really still a neutral state? I mean, it is a member of the European Union. It is basically sheltered by the United States, as you mentioned. It closely cooperates with NATO. It basically provided political and economic societal shelter by European powers and America. Can it really be portray itself? Can Sweden really portray itself as a neutral state any longer? And then on Israel, which is a simple question, I completely agree that Israel is a small state. However, its relations with the United States have made it a powerful regional actor. And then the question is, would Israel survive without American support or American shelter, to place it in my terms? Thank you.
There you go. Questions from one panelist to other panelists. We will have another round. Let me give them a chance to respond, and then in the meantime, you can collect your thoughts and ask the questions once we've given Jacob and Yaniv a chance to respond to Baldur. Yaniv, let's start, or Jacob, let's start with you.
Thanks, Baldur. It's a really interesting question, and I think it's a continuation of what Sweden was doing very successfully in the Cold War, really. Whether we think that it technically constitutes neutrality, there was always a kind of formulation that Swedish foreign ministers enjoyed using, which was that neutrality was all about, I think it was the term I used in my presentation, it was all about kind of credibility. It was this idea that even though we are clearly culturally and politically close, and we have relations with Europe, with the US, that there is enough distance and there is enough independence in Swedish relations with either different, multilateral institutions or different actors to make it credible, the idea that we wouldn't, simply bandwagoned into a conflict. And I mean, I would argue that the same probably is true today. The fact that even though there is close cooperation, that there is still a distinct Swedish line on a number of issues, and that Sweden dissents and tries to shape EU policy on a number of issues, not least the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There's a big debate in Sweden about NATO membership. A number of people think that Sweden's position is horrendously outdated and that geostrategic things have changed, so that Sweden should definitely join NATO. So I think it's a very topical question, because that conversation is definitely happening, much to the chagrin of kind of traditional social democratic politicians who think that we should be able to kind of keep this Cold War dynamic up. But so, yeah, whether or not we think that Sweden is succeeding in this neutrality is kind of open to interpretation, I guess. But I think Sweden certainly hopes that it is still succeeding.
Baldur, did you have a 20-second reaction to that?
No, it's fine. Perfect. Thank you very much.
Yaniv.
Okay, so yeah, that's a very big question. So I'll try to make it quick. Yes, Israel depends on U.S. support, undoubtedly. Part of it has to do with the fact that it's yet one more aspect in Israel's effort to create an artificial strategic depth, right? One way is, again, creating a periphery by allying with local peripheral actors. But the U.S., I mean, definitely U.S. support for Israel has been, or had been, crucial for the survival of Israel for many years. But I think many within Israel question or have started questioning the Israeli dependence on the U.S. And I think especially the Obama years were traumatic for some in Israel. I think this is the first time they realized that in the future, American support may decline. And I think that some of Israel's policies, including the attempt to establish stronger long-term alliance with local actors, and this is what I'm trying to say. Israel's attempt to establish alliances with local actors is not just about countering the Iranian threat. This is the immediate goal. But the long-term goal is to make these actors accept Israel's existence. And part of it probably stems from the fact that Israel realizes that it may not be able to support that it may not be able to rely on U.S. support in the longer term. So I can't predict when this is going to happen, but I can tell you definitely that the Israeli leadership is oriented has taken this into account when reshaping its foreign policies.
Thanks, Yaniv. We'll have another round of questions. Beverly and the gentleman at the end. So Beverly.
Thank you. Jacob, it just occurred to me when you were talking in particular about Sweden, because the main bulk of your talk was addressing Norway. Do you have anything by way of reflection on Sweden's new role regarding Yemen? I mean, Sweden has this amazing ambassador in Doha, who I think is sort of basically the ambassador of all, and reminds us on a very regular basis of the important role that Sweden plays globally, but in particular, especially in light of Sweden's role along with the other small state, obviously Switzerland, in Geneva in terms of another attempt in terms of not only building for peace, but trying to bring in the measures in terms of donor funding beyond the humanitarian effort, but I'll leave that for you to speculate on. And Yaniv, I'm really sorry, I'm going to come back and push a little further. Particularly on this idea that you're suggesting, Israel's argument for the need for strategic depth, and that's why the West Bank presents such an existential challenge, because who knows, we could all wake up tomorrow, everybody could wake up in Tel Aviv and find that Hamas are back in power or have enough control and have the missiles in the West Bank. The point being is that this was the same kind of argument that has been used for decades now regarding strategic depth. And over those decades, Israel itself has undertaken a series of policies that have addressed strategic depth or lack of, or its belief in lack of, particularly in the West Bank. And we see that with the settlements, it's quite obvious. And we see that also in its decisions to make peace with its neighbor in Jordan. And we know that strategic depth for Tel Aviv can go as far as, well, where should we stop? Tehran, Kabul, I don't know, you could draw the line. So I'm actually asking you whether, if we're going to talk about realpolitik, that's somewhat of a redundant argument based on the literal facts on the ground, be they demographic, in East Jerusalem, through Judaization of the city, or in the West Bank through settlements, or in terms of defense and weapons and strategic capability. So how does that fit in with? Because I don't doubt what you're saying in terms of your argument for seeking other other alliances within the region. But realistically, how does that really play? Because we all know what's real. We all know what's what beyond the rhetoric. So I'm sorry for pushing back again.
And then we've got the gentleman at the back, blue shirt.
Good afternoon. I think my question is more, towards Dr. Braunstein, because you mentioned Singapore, right? But I can't help but wonder the other small state that exists in Southeast Asia, which is Brunei, which is often referred as a tiny, rich sultanate. Its GDP is 90% oil. It mimics, or not even mimics, it's basically a rentier state, in theory, isn't it? So it's like, I was wondering, like, what are your reflections on Brunei? Like, what role does it play? I mean, it has a lot of BLNG, Shell, you have a lot of oil companies in Brunei, from French, Dutch to British. And my second question is, I think maybe towards all, but I don't know which one can answer the question, because, sorry, I forgot to introduce myself as well. So I'm Moiz, and I am a PhD student at NUS. I focus on Southeast Asian politics, and I'm very interested in smallness and monarchism, so the survival of monarchies within small states. Because if you look at monarchies, there's a lot of, like Bhutan, Tonga, Liechtenstein, Brunei, United Arab Emirates, even Qatar, they have really strong monarchies. So it's like, the question is more like, do you think there's a relationship between smallness and the resilience of monarchies? And maybe they provide shelter towards monarchs, because especially the rich monarchs like Brunei, Oman, Qatar, they have really, really vast oil wealth, to sort of enamor its subjects with a lot of welfare, and such as costless education and health. So it's more like, does it provide shelter to monarchies? Maybe that's more related towards, sorry, I forgot the name for the lecturer from Iceland. And by the way, I've been to Iceland, it's very beautiful.
There you go.
Thank you.
Juergen, let's start with you.
Yeah, so thank you very much for your question. I'm not a scholar on Brunei, but I imagine like Brunei is more similar, or could compare it more to something like Qatar, but just with more oil and less gas. And of course, depending in terms of your question was about Brunei and the global energy transition. So it's different from Singapore in this sense that Singapore has no oil and has no gas, like in terms of using it as a domestic feedstock for production. Singapore has to import everything from GCC countries and other countries. So this is a different aspect of it. And the second, I'm not sure in terms of the population size of Brunei, but I guess it's in terms of population and in terms of its energy resources, they are under different kind of pressures than, let's say, Saudi Arabia, which needs to create jobs and which are using enormous domestic, burning a lot of oil for producing electricity. So in this sense, how Brunei is doing in the energy transition, I guess depending on how much the costs of oil production. If Brunei is, I'm not sure whether it's a low-cost oil producer or as in the Middle East. So really depending on this will raise another questions. If they are not a low-cost producer, then they would need to start thinking of entering other, like downstream or other sectors. If they are a low-cost producer, then they just continue pumping oil until yeah. Yeah, that's. I'm sorry to not be able to. Thank you.
Thanks, Juergen. Yaniv, your response to Beverly?
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm delighted that you're pushing me on that, right? I mean, this whole idea is about debating and you know, it's about forcing me to actually think about my arguments. But I don't want to hold too much time with my colleagues. But just to point out, it is Israeli policy toward the West Bank has been paradoxical in the past few years, because on the one hand, Israel is constantly concerned about some very common phrase in Israeli public discourse, the demographic demon, the idea that the idea of losing the Jewish majority in the state of Israel, and this is one of the reasons why Israel has never formally annexed the West Bank and has a very problematic policy toward East Jerusalem. I think that in the past few years, what Israel has done is simply to abandon I don't think in the last two Netanyahu governments, there hasn't been really a cohesive policy toward the West Bank. The Israeli government has preferred to focus much more on establishing ties with regional actors, hoping that they will accept its presence in the West Bank. Israel is, okay, the way I put it, Israel has preferred to keep the situation as it is without actually coming up with policies to define its position in the West Bank. And it has hoped to persuade regional actors to accept it. So how Israel has tried to overcome this paradox that you presented. I don't think it's sustainable. It's not sustainable even in the short term. But this is how Israel has basically behaved in the past few years.
Thanks, Yaniv. Any other questions from the floor? Did you want to come in, Jacob, at some point?
Just the Yemen.
Yeah, sure.
But I have it for Baldur to go first.
Oh, why don't you start, since you've already started talking?
Real quick, I'll be brief. Sweden and Yemen, it's another example of how, you know, Sweden has kind of marketed itself as a mediator. But I think it's important to be clear about exactly what Sweden is doing and what this mediation role involves, which is effectively just bringing the parties together. It's pure facilitation. There is no real engagement on substance, at least from what I have understood from colleagues within the foreign ministry. And so, you know, a number of people criticize Sweden for effectively being unable to exert any influence on the parties. Now, on the one hand, this is, you know, unfair, because what leverage does Sweden have? And, you know, we don't traditionally think of small state mediators as having any leverage. But other people, you know, might suggest that the Swedes should be perhaps more critical of the processes that they are, you know, kind of sponsoring and engaging with. You know, are they just allowing the parties to buy time, you know, before engaging in some type of military endgame, you know, around Hodeidah, for example? And, you know, whatever violations the Houthis engage in, Sweden's not going to do anything to stop that. So it's, in a sense, it's a kind of classic, you know, fairly toothless small state mediation role that only really, I think, works if you have parties that are genuinely committed to an end of the conflict. And I'm no Yemen expert, but I don't personally see a great deal of evidence that either side is committed to ending the conflict. The one thing that Sweden, you know, really is concerned about is the image of it and being involved. And certainly for the Swedish Foreign Ministry, this is a real coup to be able to have something to show for its time on the Security Council, which was a big kind of domestic political issue that the government was really, really pushing. So they're seeing this as good evidence and good publicity for Sweden, certainly. So it's good from that sense, but what it actually means for the conflict in terms of any resolution, I honestly don't know. But in terms of what it's doing as well beyond humanitarian aid, I also don't really know, I'm afraid. I don't know the details. The only final thought on this question of monarchies and rentierism, there's been some really interesting work done on how the monarchies have weathered the Arab Spring. Some really interesting work. Names escape me off the top of my head, but it's worth having a little look. But as far as I'm concerned, that has everything to do with rentierism and actually very little to do with monarchies per se. There is an argument that perhaps monarchical loyalty and cultural and value systems comes into it. I personally don't really buy into it. I think it's the rentierism and the ability to pay off dissent that is much more convincing to my mind.
Thanks, Jacob. We have Baldur and a quick intervention from Juergen. And final remarks.
No, if I can just add, I think the literature you're referring to is primarily the works by Juan Col. Juan Col has written a lot on monarchies and the survival of monarchies. So just saying.
Baldur?
Thank you. I find the question on whether small states provide shelter to monarchies very interesting. I cannot answer the question directly, but though what I would like to say is that small states are known for how quickly they can respond to international events. For example, small states are often the first ones to move out of an international economic crisis because of their informal and flexible policy making. They can respond quickly to such events and take rapid decisions, press them through the society, and make reforms. That said, small states are also known for small networks. There are only few important policy makers in small states. And their interests are narrower. And this can often lead to corruption, and this can lead to state capture by important people or interest groups. And a new book published just at the end of last year also on democracy, the level of democracy in small states, had really interesting findings about lack of democracy in small states because of these small networks in the small states, and maybe the kings and queens of these monarchies have basically captured the state. It's easier to capture a small state than a large state.
Thanks, Baldur. Juergen?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow on the question of monarchism and rentierism, and which specifically with reference to Brunei again. So Brunei has this large, the Brunei Investment Authority. However, it's one of the most intransparent entities on earth. And the only thing that if you look at WikiLeaks, there's some very interesting stories about I don't know, in terms of there are like 50 or 60 private drivers for officials there, and it's a bit, yeah, the transparency is a big issue, and the question of how these massive oil resources, are they now kind of capitalized or financialized and put into financial resources, and where is the money flowing, and in terms of diversifying for the future, for the post-oil economy, is it going in this way, or is it going in from one pocket into another pocket? So your question raises many more questions which are very interesting, but due to the transparency, I cannot really answer the question, but it's very interesting what you're doing.
Thanks, Juergen.
Thank you.
Baldur, let me ask you a question very quickly, because you finished your presentation with the point that small states should look to institutions like the EU, NATO for their defense and security. But if one was to look at, for example, Ukraine, if one was to look at the paralysis that institutions like NATO, like the Security Council has faced in recent years, whether it's in relation to Russian belligerency, assertiveness, conflicts in the MENA region, it doesn't really look very optimistic, or rather one wouldn't have much faith in coming to these institutions, organizations for their defense. You went with us earlier on where the point was raised in relation to the decline or diminishment of collective security, for example. And I was hoping perhaps you could elaborate on that point. Very quickly, though, 40 seconds, if possible.
39 seconds, yes. I think you're absolutely right on Ukraine and how incapable many organizations are. That said, I still think that it's better for a small entity to rely on a multilateral framework, an organization like NATO, than a single protector such as Britain or the United States or Germany, when a policy shift or a new policymaker can, within few months or years, fundamentally alter the state's policy. It's more, the changes within international organizations happen more gradually. They're probably more stable. It takes a longer time to alter or change their policy than to change the policy of the state. And if Israel is worried about US backing, who isn't worried about US backing? So if we are in that situation now, that Israel is worried that the Americans will desert them, we are in a changed world, and even though we may not have much faith in international organizations, you can probably have more faith in them than a single shelter provider.
Thanks very much, Baldur. We were supposed to wrap up and summarize the proceedings, but I think we've run out of time, given that we've got only a minute or so left. But let me say on behalf of MEI, Brookings Doha Center, on behalf of Fanah Haddad, and of course myself, how honored we are to have you all here. A special thanks to our participants, guests, members of the audience, of course, for their questions, contributions, and I do hope and I'm confident this will be an ongoing project. So I look forward to seeing you all at the next one, and I believe Fanah has a couple of remarks to make.
Echo Ranj's comments. Thank you to thank you very much to all contributors and to all contributions. I would just like to add that I'll be in touch in terms of continuing the project in terms as a first next step. We do have these in-house publications that we run. They usually come out of our workshops. So last year we did one on charity networks between the Middle East and Southeast Asia. We've done another one on city-states and so forth and so forth. So I'll be getting in touch with all contributors to ask if you'd be interested in submitting something like that for this particular workshop, and we can hopefully take that forward from there. Other than that, just to say thank you very much.
Thank you.